The sound of a grown man striking a woman isn't like the movies. It's not a crisp slap or a dramatic crack, it's a dull, wet thud that sits in your gut like a stone, and that's the sound I woke up to on a Tuesday morning that was supposed to be about nothing more than coffee and replacing a few router boards on the deck. My wife Sarah is an ER nurse, the kind of woman who can triage a car wreck in high heels and stitch up a laceration without blinking. She's seen the worst of humanity on a Saturday night shift and still comes home with a softness that I never quite understood but always protected. That morning she was just trying to plant hydrangeas. She was on her knees in the dirt, wearing that faded oversized t-shirt I got from a fire crew reunion back in Montana, hair tied up in a messy bun, looking like the definition of peace, until two men in tactical vests that looked like they were bought at a Halloween discount store marched onto our lawn. I was in the garage, maybe 30 feet away, digging for a socket wrench, when I heard the aggressive baritone of a man trying too hard to sound authoritative, the kind of voice that cracks when you push it, demanding that she stop recording, and by the time I looked up through the dusty garage window, I saw the taller one, a guy I'd later learn was named Kyle, lunging forward. He didn't just grab the phone, he swung, a wild, undisciplined haymaker that caught Sarah on the cheekbone and sent her sprawling backward into the mulch, and the world just stopped, the birds went quiet, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate vanished, and the only thing left was the rushing noise of my own blood in my ears. I'm not a violent man, not anymore. I spent 12 years jumping out of planes into wildfires as a smoke jumper, and that life teaches you that panic is death. It teaches you to assess, breathe, and act with absolute precision. So I didn't scream, I didn't run out there flailing my arms like a maniac, I just walked, moving with that heavy, grounded stride you learn when you're carrying 100 pounds of gear up a ridgeline. By the time I cleared the porch, Sarah was already sitting up, hand to her face, eyes wide but not teary. She was documenting, her other hand groping for the phone that had landed in the grass, because that's who she is, evidence first, pain later, and Kyle was standing over her, chest puffing out, adjusting a utility belt that held nothing but a flashlight and a can of pepper spray, while his partner, a squat guy named Deke who looked like he'd failed police academy entrance exams 3 times in a row, was shifting nervously from foot to foot. They wore patches on their chests that said, neighborhood compliance, which is a fancy way of saying rented bullies, and when Kyle saw me coming, he sneered, probably thinking I was just another suburban husband soft from a desk job, probably expecting me to yell or threaten to sue, but I just stopped 5 feet from him and let the silence stretch out until it felt heavy enough to choke on. You just made the last mistake you'll ever make in this zip code, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, because yelling is for people who aren't sure they can control the situation, and Kyle laughed, a nervous, barking sound, stepping toward me with his hand resting on that pepper spray like it was a magic wand. He told me to back off, said he was authorized by the Elk Ridge Association to enforce code violations and that physical resistance would be met with non-lethal force, using all the buzzwords he'd probably learned in a 3-hour seminar, but he telegraphed his move from a mile away, his shoulder dipping, his eyes shifting to my throat, and when he threw the punch, it was almost sad. I stepped inside his guard, muscle memory taking over, the kind of reflex that doesn't fade just because you're retired, and I didn't even have to hit him hard, just a swift, calculated sweep of his legs and a shove to the solar plexus that sent him crashing down onto the concrete walkway with the grace of a sack of cement. Deke panicked, seeing his alpha dog wheezing on the ground, and he made a grab for me, reaching for my shirt, but I just caught his wrist, applied a little pressure to the joint, just enough to let him know that snapping it would be easier than opening a beer can, and walked him backward until he tripped over his own feet and landed in Sarah's prize-winning petunias. It was over in 10 seconds, the adrenaline hadn't even fully spiked yet, and I was kneeling beside Sarah, checking her pupil dilation, looking at the angry red welt rising on her cheek, feeling a cold, dark rage tightening in my chest that terrified me more than the fire ever did. I got it, Caleb, I got it all, she whispered, her voice shaking just a little, holding up the phone with the cracked screen, and that's when I looked up and saw the curtains twitching across the street, saw old Mrs. Gable peering through her blinds, saw the neighborhood watching, waiting, because in Elk Ridge, nothing happens in a vacuum, and everyone knew exactly who had sent these clowns. The sirens came about 8 minutes later, followed by the flashing lights that always looked too bright in a quiet cul-de-sac, and the deputies were decent enough guys, locals who knew my history, knew I wasn't the type to start trouble, but as they were cuffing Kyle and Deke, who were screaming about assault and lawsuits and how they were deputized agents of the HOA, a black Mercedes SUV rolled up the street, silent and sleek like a shark in shallow water. Out stepped Brenda Vance, the HOA president, a woman who wore blazers that cost more than my truck and had a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a smile that looked like it was painted on over a layer of absolute contempt for anyone who didn't manicure their lawn with scissors. She walked past the crying, handcuffed thugs without even looking at them, straight to the lead deputy, and started talking in that low, confidential tone she used to manipulate zoning boards and contractor disputes, spinning a web before the dust had even settled. I helped Sarah to the porch swing, getting her an ice pack, and watched Brenda work, watched her gesture at our house, at the unauthorized hydrangeas, painting us as the aggressors, as the chaotic element in her perfectly curated kingdom, but then she made eye contact with me, just for a second, and her mask slipped. I saw it, clear as day. It wasn't just annoyance, it was fear, pure, unadulterated panic hidden behind layers of foundation and arrogance. She knew Sarah had the video, she knew her goons had crossed a line that no amount of bylaws could justify, but Brenda was the type of person who doubled down when she was cornered, the type who would burn the whole forest down just to kill one beetle, and I knew right then that this wasn't over. That night, after the police left and the statement forms were filled out, the house felt different, it felt violated, like the walls were thinner, and Sarah sat at the kitchen table scrolling through neighborhood forums, her face pale in the glow of the laptop screen. "Caleb," she said, her voice tight, "look at this," and she turned the screen to show me a thread that had been posted 20 minutes after the assault, a post from an anonymous account claiming that a violent resident attacked compliance officers who were simply trying to deliver a safety notice, twisting the narrative so fast it made my head spin. It wasn't just a lie, it was a coordinated campaign. There were bot comments, fake profiles agreeing, people piling on about how some veterans bring the war home with them, and that's when I realized we weren't dealing with a petty tyrant who cared about grass height, we were dealing with a sociopath running a psychological operation from her living room. I couldn't sleep, so I went out to the back deck with a flashlight and started walking the perimeter, old habits dying hard, looking for weak points, looking for something, and that's when I saw the glint of a lens in the big oak tree that straddled the property line between us and the vacant lot next door. It wasn't a trail cam, it was high-end, hardwired, pointed directly at our bedroom window, and my blood ran cold because this wasn't about compliance, this was surveillance, this was obsession. I pulled the camera down, ripping the wire loose, and took it inside to my workbench, cracking the casing open to find a memory card, and what I found on there wasn't just footage of us, it was footage of everyone, Mrs. Gable taking her trash out in her robe, the Johnson kid sneaking cigarettes behind the garage, old man Silas cleaning his shotgun on his back porch, hours and hours of leverage, collected and catalogued. I called Big Jim, a retired state trooper who lived 3 blocks over and hated the HOA more than he hated taxes, and asked him to come over, and when he saw the footage, his face went the color of a stormy sky. "This is a RICO case waiting to happen, Caleb," he grumbled, rubbing his jaw. "She's not managing a neighborhood, she's building a dossier, she's looking for leverage on every single person who might vote against her," and suddenly the pieces started to fit, the sudden foreclosures, the families moving out in the middle of the night, the way Brenda always seemed to know who was behind on their mortgage or whose marriage was on the rocks. She was bleeding this community dry, buying up the properties through shell companies once she'd harassed the owners into selling cheap, turning Elk Ridge into her own personal rental empire, and we were just the latest obstacle in her path. But Brenda made a tactical error, she mistook my silence for weakness and Sarah's kindness for fragility. She didn't know that you don't poke a trauma nurse and you certainly don't punch a smokejumper's wife, because while she was playing chess with property values, we were preparing for a controlled burn. The next morning, a letter was taped to our front door, not mailed, taped, a cease and desist order from a law firm I'd never heard of, claiming that we were being sued for emotional distress caused to her contractors, and that a lien was being placed on our home for unpaid fines totaling $12,000, fines for violations we'd never even been notified of. Sarah looked at the paper, her bruised cheek turning a sickly shade of purple-yellow, and she didn't cry, she just walked to the fridge, grabbed a juice box, and said, "Call the news station, call the police, call everyone, Caleb, because I'm about to ruin this woman's life, and I smiled for the first time in 24 hours because the switch had flipped. We started quietly, visiting neighbors not to complain, but to listen, knocking on doors with fresh-baked cookies, Sarah's idea, classic disarming tactic, and just asking, has she targeted you too? And it was like opening a dam. Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood gossip, broke down in tears in her foyer, admitting Brenda had threatened to reveal her son's rehab stint if she didn't report on who was parking on the street. The young couple 2 doors down, the Millers, showed us emails where Brenda demanded kickbacks from the contractor they used for their roof repair, threatening to block the permit if they didn't pay up, and piece by piece, we built a map of the extortion ring that had been suffocating our street for 5 years. But the real smoking gun came from the most unlikely place, Kyle, the thug I dropped on the sidewalk, who called me from a burner phone 3 days later, voice trembling, terrified because Brenda had cut him loose, refused to pay his legal bills, and told him he was on his own. She's got a server, Kyle whispered, sounding like he was looking over his shoulder, in her basement. She keeps everything there, the financial records, the blackmail, the original unedited footage of her giving us the order to rough up your wife, and my knuckles turned white gripping the phone. He told me she was planning phase 2, something she called the cleansing, set to trigger at the next quarterly meeting, a mass eviction strategy based on fabricated violations that would force half the neighborhood into foreclosure just in time for a developer friend of hers to swoop in. We didn't have much time, maybe 48 hours before she scrubbed that server or launched her attack, so I looked at Sarah, looked at Big Jim who was cleaning his glasses with a grim determination, and said, we're not going to court, not yet, we're going to the meeting, and we're going to bring the whole show down in front of an audience. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed, the air thick with tension, buzzing like a hornet's nest that had been kicked, because rumors travel faster than light in the suburbs. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her lawyer and a new set of security guards who looked slightly more professional than Kyle and Deke, looking cool, calm, and collected, banging her gavel to demand order, treating the murmuring crowd like unruly children. We have a lot to get through tonight, she announced, her voice dripping with that fake corporate sweetness, starting with the removal of certain disruptive elements in our community, and she looked directly at me, a challenge in her eyes, daring me to speak, daring me to be the angry, violent man she'd painted me as on the internet. I stood up, slowly, holding nothing but a flash drive in my hand, and the room went deathly silent. You could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. Madam President, I said, keeping my voice level, before we discuss removals, I think we need to discuss the budget, specifically the line items labeled consulting fees that seem to flow directly into an LLC registered in your maiden name, and the color drained from her face so fast it looked like a magic trick. She tried to cut me off, shouting that I was out of order, signaling her guards to move in, but Big Jim stood up from the back row, and suddenly 6 uniformed state troopers, his old buddies who were technically off-duty, but very much interested in justice, stepped through the double doors, arms crossed, staring down Brenda's hired muscle until they backed off into the corners. This is ridiculous, Brenda screeched, losing her composure, her perfectly sprayed hair vibrating with rage. You have no proof, this is slander, and that's when Sarah plugged the laptop into the projector system. The screen behind Brenda flickered to life, not with spreadsheets, but with video, drone footage from the camera I'd found, showing Brenda meeting with a developer in a parking lot, handing over a thick envelope of cash, followed by audio recordings Kyle had sent us, her voice clear and sharp. I don't care if you have to break a few windows, just make them want to leave, make them feel unsafe. I want that property by October. The gasp from the room wasn't just shock, it was the sound of 50 people realizing they'd been living in a prison built by their own HOA dues, and the mood shifted instantly from fear to fury, a collective awakening that felt electric. But Brenda Vance wasn't done. She was a fighter, I'll give her that. Like a cornered rat she lashed out, grabbing the microphone, screaming over the video. You think you can stop me? You think this matters? I own the deed restrictions. I have the power of attorney for half this board. I can bankrupt every single one of you with legal fees before you ever see a courtroom. She was manic, eyes wild, revealing the true depth of her narcissism, proving exactly what we'd suspected, that it was never about the neighborhood, it was always about control, about being the queen of a little hill she'd constructed out of lies and intimidation. And then, in the middle of her tirade, a quiet voice cut through the noise, "Actually, Brenda, you don't," and everyone turned to see a man walking in from the side entrance, a man looking dusty and tired, holding a briefcase. It was her ex-husband, a guy everyone thought had moved to Mexico 5 years ago, but who had actually been living in a trailer 2 towns over, silenced by an NDA that had just expired at midnight. The silence that fell over the room when Greg Vance walked in was heavier than the silence after the punch. It was the kind of silence that sucks the air out of your lungs, because in Elk Ridge, Greg was a ghost story, a cautionary tale Brenda used to tell. Poor Greg, couldn't handle the pressure, had a breakdown, but here he was, looking very much sane and carrying a briefcase that looked like it held the nuclear codes. Brenda froze mid-shout, her mouth hanging open, her hand trembling so bad she dropped the gavel and it clattered on the linoleum floor like a gunshot, and for the first time, I saw the arrogance evaporate completely, replaced by the terrified look of a child who realizes the monsters under the bed are real and they have subpoenas. Greg didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at me, he just walked straight to the table, opened the briefcase, and pulled out a stack of documents thick enough to choke a horse, sliding them across the table toward the trembling HOA treasurer who looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. "She forged my signature on the deed transfers," Greg said, his voice raspy, like he hadn't used it much in years. "She leveraged the community reserve fund to pay off her gambling debts in Vegas, and those liens she put on your houses. They aren't filed with the county, they're fake, just paper threats she keeps in a drawer to scare you into submission." The room erupted. It wasn't a meeting anymore, it was a revolution. People were shouting, Mrs. Gable was actually standing on her chair shaking her fist, and Sarah, my beautiful, tough-as-nails Sarah, just stood there with her arms crossed, watching Brenda unravel with a cool, clinical detachment, like she was watching a fever break. The troopers moved in then, not aggressively, just inevitably, surrounding Brenda who had slumped into her chair, muttering something about ungrateful peasants and vision, completely dissociated from reality as the handcuffs clicked, a sound that was infinitely more satisfying than the gavel. But as they led her out, passing right by me, she stopped, and her eyes locked onto mine, dark and hollow and filled with a venom that promised this wasn't the end. She leaned in close, smelling of expensive perfume and nervous sweat, and whispered, "You think you won? You think getting rid of me fixes the rot? I was just the immune system, Caleb, wait until you see the virus." It chilled me, even in that moment of victory, because there was a conviction in her voice that didn't sound like madness, it sounded like a warning, but I brushed it off, caught up in the cheers of the neighbors, the handshakes, the feeling of the heavy weight lifting off our collective shoulders as the tyrant was hauled away into the flashing lights of the cruisers. The weeks that followed were surreal, like a long exhale after holding your breath for years. The "for sale" signs came down, the fines were voided, and we organized a block party that lasted until 2 a.m., with Big Jim grilling burgers and Kyle, who had turned state's witness in exchange for leniency, awkwardly apologizing to Sarah while holding a plate of potato salad. We dissolved the board, rewrote the bylaws to strip the HOA of enforcement powers, effectively turning it into a voluntary gardening club, and for a while, it felt like we had achieved the American dream, that we had fought the system and actually won. Sarah's bruise faded to a faint yellow memory, the hydrangeas bloomed in defiant purple clusters, and I went back to fixing the deck, feeling a sense of ownership I hadn't felt since I bought the place, thinking that the war was over and the good guys had prevailed. But peace is a funny thing, it's fragile, and nature abhors a vacuum, so when Brenda's house, that massive, imposing colonial at the top of the hill, finally went up for auction, we all watched with a wary curiosity, wondering who would buy the castle of the fallen queen. It sat empty for months, a dark spot in our bright new world, until one day a convoy of trucks arrived, unmarked white vans with out-of-state plates, and a crew of men in matching gray coveralls started unloading crates that looked suspiciously like server racks and heavy industrial equipment. The new owner wasn't a family, it wasn't a retired couple, it was a corporation, Omni Global Residential Solutions, a faceless entity that bought the property sight unseen for double the asking price, and within 48 hours, they had erected a fence, not a decorative picket fence, but an 8-foot privacy wall that blocked any view of the yard. I tried to go over there, introduce myself as the interim community liaison, do the neighborly thing, but the intercom at the gate just buzzed with static and a robotic voice told me to leave the premises immediately, and looking up, I saw the cameras, not the hidden, sneaky ones Brenda used, but big, overt, military-grade domes mounted on the corners of the wall, sweeping the street with mechanical indifference. Sarah felt it too, that prickle on the back of your neck, that feeling of being watched not by a nosy neighbor but by an algorithm, and slowly, the atmosphere in Elk Ridge shifted again, the lightness of the summer fading into a gray, paranoid autumn. We started getting emails, not from an HOA board, but from our mortgage providers, automated notices about property value adjustments and risk assessments based on data that could only have come from inside the neighborhood, data about our spending habits, our internet history, our movements. It turned out Brenda wasn't lying, she was just the analog version of a digital future. She had been collecting dirt to control us, but this new company, this corporation, they were collecting data to monetize us, turning the entire neighborhood into a smart grid experiment where privacy was the price of admission. They didn't send thugs to punch you, they just raised your insurance premiums if their cameras saw you eating fast food too often. They sent targeted ads for divorce lawyers to the couple down the street before they even knew they were fighting. They subtly manipulated the traffic lights at the entrance of the subdivision to discourage outsiders from driving through. It was cleaner, quieter, and infinitely more terrifying than Brenda ever was, because you can punch a bully in the face, you can expose a corrupt president, but how do you fight a terms of service agreement that you never signed but are living inside of? One evening, about 6 months after the assault, I was sitting on the porch, watching the blinking red eye of the camera on the fortress up the hill, nursing a beer and feeling a different kind of fatigue, a soul-deep exhaustion that comes from realizing the fight never really ends, it just changes shape. Sarah came out and sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder, and I could feel the tension in her frame, the way she subconsciously angled her face away from the street, away from the invisible eyes. We could move, she said softly, voicing the thought we'd both been dancing around, we could go to the mountains, get 40 acres, get off the grid. I looked at her, looked at the home we had fought for, the garden she had bled for, and I thought about the neighbors, Mrs. Gable, Big Jim, the people who had stood up when it mattered, and I realized that running away was exactly what the algorithm wanted. It wanted churn, it wanted disjointed, isolated people who were easier to process. No, I said, taking her hand, feeling the scar tissue on her knuckles where she'd scraped them against the pavement that day, we don't run. Brenda was phase 1, this, whatever this is phase 2, and we beat the first boss, we can figure out how to beat the machine. But as I said it, I looked at the Omni Global house, and the gate opened, just a crack, and a car slid out, a black sedan, tinted windows, and as it passed under the street lamp, the window rolled down just an inch. I couldn't see the face, not clearly, but I saw the silhouette, the sharp angle of a jaw, the perfectly coiffed hair, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a flash of a smile, a familiar, mocking smile that chilled me to the bone. Was she working for them? Was she a consultant? Or was she just a symptom of a world where neighborhoods are assets and neighbors are data points? The car disappeared into the night, leaving us on the porch in the cooling air, and I pulled Sarah closer, realizing that the victory we celebrated was just a ceasefire in a much longer war for the right to simply exist in peace. We went inside and I locked the door, engaging the deadbolt, but I knew that locks only keep out honest people and thieves, they don't keep out the future, and they certainly don't keep out the past when it decides to drive by and wave. So here I am, sharing this with you, not to scare you, but to tell you to look at your own fences, look at who's running your board, look at those new terms and conditions you blindly click accept on, because the punch in the face is the least of your worries, it's the invisible hand slowly tightening around your throat that you need to watch out for. And if you see a black sedan idling down the street, or a camera pointed where it shouldn't be, don't just close the blinds, grab your phone, document everything, and stand your ground, because if we don't hold the line at our own front doors, we won't have anywhere left to retreat to.